This week I had two conversations, both focusing on the upcoming prisoner strike from August 21st to September 9th, 2018. One with a member of the IWOC or IWOC, and one with Amani Sawari, a media liaison for some of the prisoners who called for the strike. In part one, Amani Sawari will speak about the prison strike, the need to increase opportunities for release and civic engagement for prisoners and former prisoners in the face of historical disenfranchisement, and she'll be reading some statements and demands from the prisoner organizers. Then we'll hear from Brooke, an organizer with the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee of the IWW. Brooke is based in Oakland, California. He'll talk about IWOC and their role and the views of prison organizing, labor organizing, and the upcoming strike. More from IWOC can be found at incarceratedworkers.org. More from Amani Sawari can be found at sawarimi.org. That's sawarimi.org. The viewpoints expressed by the two guests are at times contradictory and at others redundant, but we felt it better to keep their voices mostly intact and distinct rather than trying to weave them to create a streamlined narrative.
As many listeners have no doubt heard, the remaining 38 J20 defendants got their charges dropped the other day without prejudice. This means that the cases could theoretically be opened again at any time, though this is thought to be pretty unlikely. This is a historical moment not only for the courts, who were staggeringly unable to rise to the occasion, humiliating themselves at pretty much every possible turn, but also for anarchists everywhere. This whole long, difficult year and a half forged bonds that are all the more strong for having gone through the fire together, which can and no doubt will experience similar oppressions, difficulties, and tough breaks with the same finesse and resilience which was demonstrated here. To anyone listening who is personally affected by this, you are an inspiration. Now we get to celebrate, and now we get to feel the full extent of our power.
And to Kirchhoff and Qureshi, f*** you! You lost. Whew. Got to say it. If you're missing the voice of Sean Swain, like we are, here's a little plug with his voice to get some juices flowing.
Here at the Channel Zero Network, we give no preferential treatment to liberals or conservatives. They all remain duct-taped in the basement until their respective ransoms are paid in full. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain with the Final Straw Radio Show on the Channel Zero Network. Channel Zero Network, because every countdown ends at 0.
Now that you've heard him, please consider giving a call to the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction Director Gary Moore at 614-387-0588. That's 614-387-0588. Or you could call Warren Correctional Warden Shay Harris at 513-932-3388. That's 513-932-3388. And ask them about Sean's whereabouts and restrictions to his communication. If you find out anything interesting, maybe that we haven't learned yet here, about his silence, you can drop us an email at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net, or you can email Sean Swain at riseup.net. Thanks a lot. Meanwhile, here's a jingle for a show on the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts.
In the eyes of the government, we are the enemy.
In a world where there is no government, anarchy rules. This summer, get ready for the most action-packed podcast.
We continue fighting because we hate all authority and love freedom, which cannot be given, but must be taken.
Such zines as This Is Not a Dialogue, A Crime Called Freedom, Party's Over, and many, many more.
For more text and audio material of interest to anarchists,
check out resonanceaudiodistro.org.
Would you please introduce yourself for the listeners and talk about your affiliations?
I am Amani Sawari. I own the site sawarimi.org, and I came into this work through my work with Crystal Roundtree and Millions for Prisoners last year. I worked heavily on the August 21st strike that was in Washington, D.C. and came up into this following year.
That's awesome. And how did the strike go last year?
Last year it went really well. We had a monthly newsletter that went out between the 12th and the 15th of every month. And I wrote that newsletter. It was called No Shackles. And that helped kind of gain community support inside and connect the inside prisoners with the organizations on the outside that were supporting them. I got to attend the march that was in Washington, D.C., and there was a great number of people that came all across the country to meet up and voice our opinions about prisoners' rights and human rights.
And can you talk about what was mobilizing people on the inside and the outside? Like, what is it about the situation of prisoners in the United States that listeners should understand and be outraged and act to join in this mobilization for this year's strike?
Listeners need to understand that prisoners are human beings and should be able to that are fulfilling and live lives where they feel like they can accomplish their goals someday. They should be treated like humans, and they should be able to have the right to vote, which is a big right that we're fighting for right now with the national prison strike. You don't just want to have a strike where everyone comes out and marches on one day and then forgets about prisoners' rights. Prisoners are inside and they want to have legislative power so that they can make changes in their communities, especially those that are serving decades-long sentences and life sentences. They want to be able to have an impact on their community and have a political impact inside and outside.
What can you tell us about the process of engaging with prisoners to amplify these demands and organize on the outside based on desires from the inside? Like, how does prisoner-led organizing translate into the outside world?
I think prisoner-led organizing in this realm is the most powerful type of organizing that you can do, because the prisoners know exactly what's happening on the inside, and they don't know what's happening on the outside to support them until they see us. So they bring out these demands, and some of the demands that are listed in for the national prison strike are giving prisoners the right to vote, having Pell Grants reinstated in all the U.S. territories, improvements on prison policies, and an end to prison slavery. So an end to private corporations taking advantage of prisoners, working for them when they're incarcerated. These are some of the demands. So when prisoners put out these demands, people on the outside are able to show their support for those demands by having rallies, having marches, saying that they refuse to shop at places like Starbucks, places like Victoria's Secret, and other businesses that use prison labor. It's these types of actions that we do on the outside that show people on the inside that we're supporting them. And the more that we take these steps in refusing to participate with these businesses, and going out and voicing, hey, we want prisoners' rights to be heard, the more they see us supporting them and the stronger that they can become, because the guys and the women on the inside are really facing some dangerous risks by choosing to be leaders in a prison strike movement. So the least we can do is support them when they say, hey, can you guys boycott these companies?
I feel like the way that prisons are talked about in American culture and American politics, for the most part, is to point to the guilt or the undeservingness of individuals who are behind bars. And an implication of that is that people who are behind bars, alongside of just there being bars and barbed wires and difficulty for people to get to the prisons to visit their loved ones or family members or what have you, is this social shaming that happens around incarceration. So for someone who's listening, who maybe has a conservative bent, and I doubt they're going to listen to the podcast, but they might hear it on the radio and be like,
right?
Well, what about these like undeserving people who have already hurt people? Like, why should they have any of these things? They don't deserve this. They need to be locked up in a cage. How do you like talk to folks like that and sort of point to outside of just saying, well, you know, these are human beings. like there are systemic problems that cause certain people to be incarcerated at higher rates than other people. And a lot of that has to do with race, and a lot of that has to do with class, and a lot of that has to do with gender. Like, how do you start that conversation? And for listeners who maybe want to start those conversations, do you have any like tips of maybe directions to start talking to churchgoers or loved ones or community members?
I think the biggest thing that we have to remember is when someone does a crime against society or is found guilty of committing a crime against society, that crime can't be completely repaid and that healing can't happen until that individual is brought back out into society to serve society. So just throwing someone away and saying, hey, we're going to shame you for the rest of your life, regardless of what they did, whether it's stealing, killing, destroying, whatever, we're going to send you away and never look at you again. No one is served by that. Nothing good comes out of that. A lot of these men and women go into prison and they rediscover themselves and redefine who they are. And they think to themselves, okay, now I have these goals. The purpose of someone going to prison and being rehabilitated is for them to rethink about who they want to be. They think about who they were, and then they come out, hopefully, a different person that wants to serve their society. If people aren't coming back out to serve society, then it's a huge cost, which we see in a financial way, but it's also a huge social cost and a societal cost because we never see these people come back into the world and use their gifts and their talents and their strengths to serve us. Every single individual that's incarcerated is connected to hundreds of other people and has gifts and talents that could be used for the greater good. The cure to cancer could be in a prison cell. You never know what's in there that we need back out with us. And we need to give these individuals the resources to be able to be all that they're supposed to be. And we can't do that by continuing to dehumanize and degrade them and steal from their families in the process.
So you use the term prison slavery, and that's a term that I've heard from people, for instance, in the Free Alabama movement, inside and outside prisoner organizing in that southern state. And they kind of take some of the ideas of Michelle Alexander and run with them a little bit further, saying that the passage of the 13th Amendment didn't in fact abolish slavery in the United States. It just opened a different door for racialized incarceration and forced labor. And that creates a second tier of citizenship for people who do get outside, as you said, don't necessarily have the right to vote, for instance. Can you talk about that continuation of racialized incarceration and forced labor in the United States? And I don't know if this is actually, I jumped into this without asking you if this is a view that you take yourself, but.
Oh, this definitely is a view that I take. And a lot of incarcerated folks are calling for the abolishing of the 13th Amendment. The strike that I participated in last year, the Millions for Prisoners Human Rights March, called for the abolishing of the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment just reassigned the way that slavery would be used. It would no longer be based on race. So now it was expanded to be based on someone being assigned a criminal and having this criminal status, which would, as you said, place them in a second class for the rest of their lives in a lot of cases in a lot of states. When the 13th Amendment was written, it wrote slavery into the Constitution. Slavery wasn't mentioned in this sort of way until that amendment was written. So to end slavery, we need to take the 13th Amendment out of the Constitution because it doesn't serve us. And if prisoners are saying now we want to remove this amendment, if the descendants of slaves are saying now we don't want this amendment, then why are we continuing to allow it to govern the way that we do criminal justice and the way that we treat people? So yes, I do hold that view. And I feel like the 13th Amendment is what a lot of this is built on. And once it's removed, then we can look for other policy changes so that slavery isn't in practice in this country anymore. I think that the writers of the Constitution were very careful not to give up their most profitable practice, They didn't just want to write it away. They wanted to make sure that it was reserved for future use, and it continues to be a little over a century later.
So as you've mentioned, this is the third year in a row that we've been hearing about prisoners organizing a strike, and the dates of this year's strike appear to match up with the dates of the last two, including overlapping with Black August. But can you talk about the significance of the dates that folks are doing this on?
So the dates are really significant. Black August has always been a very important month when it comes to revolutionaries that are incarcerated. And August 21st through September 9th really just marks those two big dates. Black August is a month where prisoners really go out on a limb and take risks, because in the past, ever since 1979, when Black August was originally labeled, okay, this is going to be our month of practicing solidarity with others who are against prison slavery. Ever since that time, prisoners have been coming together and saying, okay, this is going to be the month where we strike, where we refuse to work, where we refuse to use the phones, where we refuse to eat, so that they can be unified on this front. So prisoners will know, even if they haven't heard from any other prisoners, or even if they've been sent to solidarity, that, okay, this is a month where I know that hundreds and thousands of men and women incarcerated across the United States are going to be unified with me on this front. George Jackson was assassinated on August 21st in San Quentin prison in 1971 by guards. So ever since then, George Jackson has been an icon for prisoners and for revolutionaries and for prison abolitionists. And Black August has been a pivotal month for everyone who's involved in the fight against prison slavery to come together.
So in Canada, they have Prisoners' Justice Day, and that's been a day of action, organizing, and contemplation. That happens on August 10th since 1975. The 1975 one-year anniversary of the suicide of Edward Nolan, who had been suffering through segregation at the Millhaven Penitentiary in so-called Ontario. Do you think that this momentum is building towards a more active yearly practice of Black August? Because in the United States, Black August, for instance, has been mostly like racialized prisoners practicing it. But it seems like this series of yearly strikes could possibly expand that into the wider prisoner population, without losing the significance of the anniversary of George Jackson's demise.
Right. I think I didn't even know about Prisoners' Justice Day in Canada, so that's really exciting to know that there's sort of an international trend happening in August. Recently, we've gotten international requests for interviews, and I really think that people are across the world starting to recognize that there's a huge problem, particularly in the United States, when it comes to incarceration. You mentioned the new Jim Crow. There have been documentaries. People are really just looking at our criminal justice system and drawing the connection between that and the slave era, and seeing that there is some really despicable and disgusting things going on. So the more that we come together internationally, the stronger that this could be. And I think it's really exciting to see that there's some correlation between Canada and the United States when it comes to August days of remembrance for prisoners.
Recently, people who are documented, I imagine, are spending more time paying more attention to the despicable policies of the federal government in terms of the border, the internalization of the border, the incarceration of darker-skinned people who police think maybe don't have documentation, or for people who don't have documentation, who are trying to just live their lives, be in community, have their families, and work their jobs.
Right.
Often because they or their parents were escaping from some terrible situation that was basically fostered by the United States in their home countries.
Right.
And I think that there's a really, and I'm not the first to say this obviously, but there's a really strong correlation between the apparatuses that are being applied to break up these families and to build a wall across indigenous lands on the border, and the same system that runs parole and probation and puts people behind bars across the United States, that denies them voting rights, that, you know, torments people throughout their life. And oftentimes, again, that falls along racialized borders of black and brown people getting hardest hit, and indigenous folk.
Right.
Can you talk about, like, if somebody is seeing the horrors that are going on, that are being amplified around border issues and citizenship, and they're getting really upset about that, how do you frame this upcoming prisoner strike and the long-standing terror that the prison system in the United States applies?
I think that the long-standing terrors, we can see a correlation between what's happened in the African American community, what's happened in indigenous peoples communities, what's happened in immigrant folks communities who are coming into the United States. We see that. We see, it's particularly in the Black community, people are being bred for incarceration. We're not given the proper resources in our schools. Black and brown students are expelled at higher rates, and then put into juvenile detention facilities at higher rates, and then incarcerated at higher rates. We see this just in the ghetto, where we're not given the resources that we need to have productive lives, where we're not given the opportunities or access to jobs that we would need to get out of poverty. And then we see this same trend across borders, where resources are taken out of regions, and then people are fleeing poverty to come to the United States, and then incarcerated just for living, and just for being in the United States. I feel like, as we saw in the past, historically, Black people being separated in their families, and we kind of turned an eye against it. And now we see in detention centers, people being separated from their families. We can no longer continue to turn a blind eye against it. I think that when we start to come together, indigenous people and Black and brown people and immigrant people come together and say, we're all fighting the same fight. Our resources are being taken away by a government, and it's leading us to be in poverty, and we're not being given the resources that we need to get out of this. We need to demand to have our resources back, demand to build up our communities, demand to have our people back, so that we can get out of this oppressed state. Jailhouse lawyers released a statement recently in support of the abolishing of ICE. And I just want to read a portion of what they put out. Solidarity with those detained, children, women, and men, by immigration and customs enforcement, and the families you are forcibly kept from. You are held in those for-profit galgs whose names are to maintain a rotten nationalist, racist, capitalistic social order. The August 21st National Prison Strikes called for strikes and boycotts in and against those so-called immigration detentions for a reason: to acknowledge for the world that our struggles are not separate. The prison industrial slave complex is a massive dehumanization business. With the ongoing rages against the detentions, we now feel justified in our call for national strikes and outside protests against these places: immigration, federal, state, and jails. That for the most part are warehouses of human bodies. Those occupying the so-called immigration detentions must not allow a small concession by a policy change to make you go away. You hold the keys to change. A full demand to abolish immigration and customs enforcement should be the only resolution on the table. Otherwise, the same problems will persist. Strike now and strike hard while the momentum is going. August 21st, thousands of prisoners in other places of detention will be joining at all costs. We will keep the beam on the so-called immigration enforcement. No let up. Educate, organize, mobilize, resist, abolish ICE. Jailhouse lawyers speak.
Well, so if someone is interested in getting involved in contributing to the momentum towards the strike or towards organizing in their own communities. Do you have any ideas about how they would, who they could talk to, or where they could find resources, or maybe where to start?
So a great place to find resources is on my site, sawarimi.org. So that's SAWARIMI.org, and then /national-prison-strike. And if you go to sawarimi.org, there's a tab on the top that says National Prison Strike. There you'll see a list of all the demands and different ideas for how to help. Some ideas are to just print our newsletter and distribute that, and really distributing that to people that you know that are incarcerated and giving them extra copies to give to people who are incarcerated. Another way that you can help is if you are a part of an organization or even a business that wants to endorse the strike. You can go to the groups and organizations and solidarity tab and fill out the contact form there and provide your endorsement of the strike. One thing that's really important for us is for incarcerated and previously incarcerated folks to know their rights when it comes to voting. So if you're interested in putting together just a voting packet and letting us know who can vote in your state out of previously incarcerated folks, what the rules are, and please send those in to us, and you can do that through the contact form as well. We also have a toolkit that we're just putting together with those different voting rights pamphlets that you can find on the website as well. So what's really important to know is the strike is to raise awareness for the campaigns. So we want to call attention to what's happening in the prisons while also providing a solution. The solution is for prisoners to have legislative power. So we want to push for that and to continue to push for that until it starts happening on a wider scale.
Is there any danger you could see in passing paperwork talking about organizing for the strike into prisoners? Like in terms of if the mailroom reads that, is there a worry that prisoners will get put on a list or punished?
Well, right now, and what I've done in the past with the newsletters, prisoners receive a lot of mail. A lot of prisoners who are revolutionary in mindset might already be on some sort of watch list. It might take longer for them to get their mail. Sensitive information isn't in the packets. I've received letters from prisoners saying, oh, it took an extra 2 weeks for me to get your newsletter, but I'm really glad I got it. Our main goal of the newsletter is for prisoners to stay informed and to know that there are people supporting them. While the newsletter calls for prisoners to join us in this movement, it's not calling for violence. It's not calling for riots. It's calling for prisoners to know what the demands are of the strike and to join us in a safe way during the strike times. Prisons are already aware of Black August. They've been aware for the past years. We really want prisoners to just know that they're being supported, and that's what the newsletter is. So when you go through the newsletter, you'll just see stories of local groups who are having different demonstrations. And it's really just for prisoners to get and know, like, there are people behind you. So you're safe. Feel free to strike. Feel free to demonstrate. You don't have to be afraid because there are people behind you, prisoners, incarcerated folks, previously incarcerated folks, and activists who are calling attention to what's happening. There's also a mailing address on the bottom of the newsletter for prisoners to write in. They can send art. Their art is one of the most valued things that we like putting in the newsletter, their poetry, and articles that they write about their experiences.
Well, thank you so much for having this chat and for all the work that you're doing. I can't wait to see what happens.
Yeah, I really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and to let your listeners know about what's going on. And hopefully this sparks a fire in some people to want to get involved and to want to be a part of what we're doing.
I hope so. Could you please introduce yourself for the listening audience and talk about the kind of work that you do?
Yeah, my name's Brooke. I'm an organizer with the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee with the Oakland chapter, as well as working on the national level. And I do abolitionist and prisoner support work.
And for people who might not know what abolitionism is, could you give a brief rundown of what that term means?
Abolitionist work is distinct from criminal justice reform or simple prisoner rights movements. It seeks the complete destruction of the institution, and in fact, like the whole power relationship between policing and basically people, between institutions and people. So it's a much broader vision, and perhaps some folks view it as apocalyptic or like total vision, although like most of the work on the ground entails quite a bit of incremental and immediate and material campaigns.
Can you break down what IWOC is, like how it came about and what kind of work y'all do?
Yeah, about 3 or 4 years ago, there was a drive within the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, a radical union. I mean, that has its own history. We could go into that a little bit. There was a push within the union to extend its reach towards prisoners and waive dues and start reaching out to prisoners and contacts as they come to us from inside. This also dovetailed with a number of other nascent prisoner movements within various institutions throughout the South, the Midwest. The California hunger strikes had just happened out here in California, and prisoners were essentially starting to engage in collective action on their own behalf. And this came in the form of work stoppages, refusing movements, as well as like the previous tactics of hunger strikes and boycotts of commissary. What makes IWOC a little different than other organizations is that we straddle movements. We straddle labor, we straddle abolition, we deal with policing, we deal with different populations, and we do it across a very intensely policed relationship. That is, we have to communicate through prison walls, phone calls, visitations, and also across an intense difference in terms of power and access to communication, in terms of background. People on the outside have got a lot of options in terms of what they do with their time, their activity, how they communicate. Prisoners generally come from a very modestly educated background. Most people are in there for one form of what George Jackson called food getting, quote unquote, or essentially, quote, crimes, unquote. I'll put that in quotations for right now because we don't accept the state's definitions of any of these concepts, but basically are in there for lateral hostilities that are basically born of conditions of inequality. Essentially, we're organizing across intense differences, and we're one of the few organizations that's essentially committed to aiding prisoners collectively organizing on their own behalf, not including them as an adjunct to outside campaigns. Although many of those are worthy and to be respected, a lot of them aren't. We can speak a little bit too about how within movements there are essentially class systems or hierarchies. Prisoners are now coming into their own voice and demanding their own place within the outside movement, and IWOC is one of the few organizations that's dedicated to making that happen.
Are there a certain type of prisoners that are getting involved in IWOC on the inside, and then like a certain class of education or experience of people that are becoming the primary members and who are trying to engage other prisoners from that standpoint? Or is it just, are you just reaching random prisoners and inviting them into the organizational structure?
Well, everyone's free to join no matter what, as long as they're down with like the preamble and the general principles. Just like on the outside, people can sign up. There's not like a strict vetting procedure or an intense background search. If you're down with it, you can like sign the form, send it in, and you're a member. So that when it comes down to the actual nut of your question, I think, which is like who are we actually reaching and working with, and like what is that spectrum? It's just as it is on the outside with a really wide people that are interested, but I think even a little bit wider, because within prison, some people are joining or corresponding with us out of straight boredom, out of having nothing to read and having very essential and like human aspects of existence denied them, like the freedom to speak to another human being and be recognized as such, to be able to read something, to spend one's time writing. Like, these are all in very, under strict control inside. So a lot of folks, to tell you the truth, sign up or correspond with us just out of loneliness. But we see that's still, though, incredibly relevant. Most of the prisoners' movement and drive is in every demand, including the demands for this present strike, are all essentially bids for rehumanization against a system that explicitly and intentionally dehumanizes them. So, like, we don't consider that irrelevant or like a lesser class of contact. Like, maybe a little less likely to motivate or initiate collective action on the inside, but still, like, completely within our mandate, and we take their correspondence seriously. I mean, on the other end of the spectrum, we're also corresponding with hardcore prison organizers with that have they probably might have been in for decades and have a very developed political consciousness that was basically forced by their situation as a prisoner. They might have even been a legacy of previous prisoner movements or political activity on the outside, or just simply been politicized by their struggle on the inside. And they might have been hunger strike and work stoppage veterans, or even been affiliated with any variety of the internal, street organizations, which the state calls gangs. We don't use that word. So there's a really wide spectrum, and it also varies state to state. Not only does the level of the prisoners movement vary from state to state and locale to locale, but also populations are a bit different. Overall, prisons are astonishingly similar, in their basic thrust once you begin to study and interact with them. But in their local situation, like, for instance, California's population is 40% like what they call Hispanic, whereas, the black population is only 19% of our total prison population. This is completely different than it is in Angola, Louisiana, which is different than Michigan. So our concerns and even the language people speak inside is a little different here in California. Even, I would say too, the amount of contacts we have in different states really varies, either due to the word of IWOC spreading, hand to hand, the literature being spread around, or having effective campaigns or a strong local outside really tends to help boost the relationship between the inside and the outside. Other folks from states where we don't have a strong local or presence within the facility might just be thumbing through another publication and reach out at random, basically to get reading material or start corresponding, or basically inquire, who are you and what do you do? That's quite often a letter we get, just simply inquiring as to what the nature of our institution is and wanting to learn more.
An interesting thing about the IWW, I think, is its historical role in attempting to organize outside of the framework of how power wants people to organize. For instance, a lot of the small shop organizing that you can see happening over the last decade and a half that the IWW has been involved with on the outside doesn't necessarily fall within the bounds of, as far as I'm aware, National Labor Relations Board, NLRB style of organizing, and it's more of a power campaign by working folks with actually engaging in it. And I think that's interesting. And you brought up street organizations. Could you talk a little bit about the attempt to organize inside and outside, and sort of if there's much of a precedent for outside of street organizations that may have people within and people without organizing through the prison walls?
Yeah, I mean, the largest and most notable inside-outside organizing and explicitly political effort in the 20th century was the Nation of Islam, which had an immense influence, not only on the prisoners movement, but on basically the Black liberation struggle after World War II and before. I think there have been some histories written on this rather recently. As far as labor unions go, there was, a big push in the 70s in about 4 different states that I know of, possibly more. But there was a North Carolina, prisoners union. There was a California, prisoners union. And these were essentially more organized along the lines of a typical labor union, basically seeking redress, for wage, grievances and condition grievances, and following the more typical kind of negotiation route and seeking recognition as a union. They had their own publications, and trying to unearth this these days is quite a challenge. I don't think there's been a lot of scholarship on this yet. What we find are like scraps and little stacks of old mimeograph newsletters from the 70s that someone held onto that are part of archives. We have yet to really have like that person or persons like go into all these archives and like put something together. The inside outside work that's going on now, well, the IWW is kind of it's a curious thing. I only joined recently, and that was primarily, I mean, I'm an IWOC organizer first. That's how I came to this stuff. But I had known about the IWW, and I'd known some of its history. And it seems to have benefited almost by a kind of a period of dormancy. Like, to be real, like the IWW was not a force or a real union in any way during most of the 20th century. It had basically lain dormant from the heyday from 1905 when it was founded up through the 20s and 30s when it was a viable force. Some would even say like the heyday ended like in 1919, but it was still a force like in pre-war, United States and internationally a little bit. But it was basically went dormant into being essentially, some WOBs will be upset at me for saying this, but essentially a historical society of like a small pocketed group of people that basically may have dual carded, which is like had membership in another union, but also like kept their red card or their IWW card like up. And there's a continuity there. So like the organization didn't go completely dead and then kind of lost, but it basically wasn't viable or of any real threat, and also didn't produce any real theoretical advances during those centuries till like the resuscitation of it in the 90s. So I think that's one of the factors in the way that it's been able to retain some of the relevance of that earlier, labor movement. It didn't go through, it basically got smashed. It wasn't one of the parties that was sought out to negotiate, with in the pre-World War II days. It didn't turn into the AFL-CIO and sign the NLRB Act, sign all these like incredibly like limiting and essentially self-decapitating agreements with the state about the right to strike, about grievances, about who mediates, and essentially follow that path down business unionism towards being a layer of management. It seems like if anybody was to take on like prisoner, organizing, it would have to be like this kind of new face of the IWW. And that's proven out. Like the only other solidarity we've gotten from any other labor union at all in public was basically the United Auto Workers branch of Berkeley, because basically they organized, Marxist postgraduate students as TAs. And that was the only group that's expressed any endorsement of the 2016 strike. The rest of labor won't touch this at all, although they're more than happy to basically organize the guards and the administration with the public sector unions. So we basically retained the nature of a confrontational stance with the state and never like signed away our right to basically organize on our own level and our own way. Because like the recent Janus Act, in which, it basically takes away a union's right to enforce dues collection for state unions. Like, we realize that's, it will affect labor, but it's in no way a death blow to us at all. All our dues are voluntary. We organize on our own behalf. Like, we don't rely upon these mechanisms within workplaces to keep ourselves alive or to like move forward. I mean, and truth be told, we are like a small gnat. We're like we're not a huge force on the landscape, but, all it takes is a spark. We don't really anticipate being a huge union, but we're still a pretty viable and like demonstrable force for actually intervening in the workplace and in a really legitimate and like powerful way. I mean, it's no accident that we've been able to make inroads at actually organizing like shops in fast food. I mean, SEIU did the Fight for 15 thing, but they didn't really organize any fast food workers. They basically used fast food workers as a propulsive force for their legislative policy efforts. And for a union to not actually take up organizing workplaces, like what has become of the SEIU? They actually had an abundant like entry into that whole industry where they could have rocked it to the core, and they let it go. But the IWW is doing it. I guess maybe we don't have that grand tactical sense of the SEIU, or we don't have to negotiate with the Democratic National, Party. So we can actually like do these like relevant things. In a way, it's like incredibly free to have not a whole lot to lose we don't have to worry about like our relationship with the AFS-CME or SEIU. If we organize prisoners in a facility, then that will piss off the other unions there. Because like, you know, seriously, them. They're basically organizing jailers. And in the same way, cops are not workers. Neither are correctional officers. They're the enemy.
I think it's a really important thing to say.
Yeah.
You mentioned the 2016 strike. Can you talk a little bit about how the strikes have gone the last few years and like how they developed and how this year's a little bit different?
Well, 2016, it kind of caught people before Trump was elected. It caught a bit of media buzz. It was kind of the introduction of this whole concept of like of there being a prisoners movement at all on the left. And so we got a good bit of attention. This time around, we don't have that like edge of novelty. And we have all the additional hurdles of like increased repression, because the state has certainly learned its lessons, you know, and ramped up repression like early and deep. In terms of the media landscape too, it's a lot more crowded. You know, it's always kind of curious trying to like hypothesize what gets attention and what doesn't within the media landscape. And it can drive you a little crazy. I mean, when you're organizing on behalf of like something like this, you're always like have your attention turned to the task of like grabbing some of the attention or baiting the hook or getting that interview or getting the point across and getting coverage. So you're really at opposition to the whole viral nature of like present media. It kind of decides on its own. And you always kind of are ended up with a task like, do you want to debase like what you're doing with memes or shoddy bandwagoning, like trying to jump onto other things in order to just kind of grab a little bit of attention, or you just keep doing the steady work. And, you know, both can happen. But this time around, I would say the media attention is definitely a little different. And most recently with the abolish ICE thing, you know, just kind of taking off and grabbing a lot of attention. And I think it's relevant. I don't think it's a bad thing, but it's just kind of something that we're dealing with. In terms of the prisoners movement itself, well, these things inside, it's very interesting in how they're developing, and that we're only getting snapshots of it. We could have a much clearer picture of how these things are federating together if we were allowed the slightest bit of communication that wasn't surveilled with the inside. But the stuff that we have been able to pick up, and that's just public information, is the hotbed for prisoners movements organizing are exactly the states where the tax base has collapsed, where they're still like holding to a very industrial, massive level of incarceration in terms of, you know, it's one of their basic tools of social control, but they don't have the dedicated tax base to support it. This also happens to be, coincidentally, the South as well as Michigan. And when you look at the map of where the prisoners movement is developing the most, with, say, a map of lynchings within the United States around the 1900s, it's the same. If you looked at a map of where slavery, where chattel slavery was instituted, and where prisoners movements are most developing, it's the same map. It's the same footprint. All these things are on the same continuum in terms of like America and what it's about and how it basically controls its population. So I would say a lot of it's coming out of the South as well as Michigan, because other states like California, for example, it's no exception to America's basically settler colonial mentality, and also its carceral, you know, method in the way it basically brutalizes and incarcerates people to maintain social control. But it also spends a lot of money to maintain a huge system that's more professionalized and basically also more restrictive. In these places where tax bases have collapsed, cell phones are much more prevalent and a lot cheaper to get, which is essentially how a lot of these prisoners movements are organizing amongst each other. You know, there are other, you know, communication channels, but that's a big one of them. Prisoners are on WhatsApp or on Facebook or on Twitter here and there, and they come and go once they get their phones smashed or, you know, they get confiscated. But the whole contraband market, which the guards can't seem to relinquish. I mean, 80% of all contraband in every single study that's ever looked at it, you know, 80% of that contraband comes in with the guards. And the guards are bringing in the tools by which the prisoners organize themselves. It's kind of an interesting technological, like, I don't know, backlash. They're immensely wanted, you know, consumer item that's cheaply produced, and that, and then the guards, basically part of the budget restrictions of these kind of crunched departments of correction, guards are looking to make extra money because they're basically making $18, $19 an hour, possibly. They're looking to make extra money, so they import cell phones, which are turning out to be a really important tool in the destruction of the prison system itself. It's a really kind of capitalist feedback loop. It's breeding its own destruction. And in terms of like the prisoner organizing that happens, I mean, even without cell phones, word travels through papers, through radio reports, through other prisoners. You have to realize that it's not a completely static population, that for a huge chunk of this country, you don't need to explain like what prisons are about because they're a facet of daily life. And guess what? It's black, it's brown, and it's poor whites because you basically rotate through the prisons. There's a circuit. Someone's going in or someone's coming out. And basically 11 million people in this country get churned through jails, just get basically locked up on one thing or another. They go in or they get sprung or they're on bail or they get held or get released. That this population of like 2.3 million that's basically bandied about, that's just a snapshot of one moment of people that are basically incarcerated under a conviction, So the way word travels through is basically word of mouth, as well as some notable publications like the Bayview and some of the other, like Sectarian Left publishes newspapers. I mean, we publish a lot of stuff. The way the internal prison movements are organized, most likely participants are people with literally long or heavy sentences. They're kind of the backbone because they've also the ones that have come to a certain political understanding of their surroundings. They're also the ones that have a certain respect or status within the facilities. They're also the repositories of previous organizing methods. The state itself, by like hemming people up and keeping them locked up forever, has basically started creating an educated, class of prisoner that's been through work stoppages or riots, or seen the variety of things happen, seen the kind of churn and change of populations, seen youth come in and then see them depart as like older men. So basically the state itself, again, is fueling the prisoners movement, not only with like their completely horrid conditions and their essential mandate of dehumanization and social control, but due to the length of sentences, they're creating an educated class. Even though they're not really allowed access to libraries and much theory or even overtly political literature, that basically by navigating and surviving the system for years, you're basically creating a veteran organizer. So in the years between, in the recent years, the periodicity of, how often these uprisings are happening is the tempo is increasing. Again, it's kind of hard to get good data on this because essentially right now there's a prison that's undergoing an uprising right now. Like we don't know where it is or what it is, but it's happening. And we will only get news essentially if certain things happen, if it makes it to an outside reporter. There might be a reporter that has a beat that includes the prison, so news will get out. Someone might work at an emergency room at a local hospital to a facility, so news of the injuries will get out, and then the story will happen. So the news we get of it is pretty hit or miss. But once you start paying attention and picking up all the little signs, and also once you learn to completely disbelieve anything the DOCs tell you, like about an uprising or this being squelched, you learn to read between the lines to see exactly what's going on. And these uprisings increasing in frequency, and they're also starting to develop a much more political character. They're much less about. There's still plenty of fights and still plenty of internal warfare and lateral hostility between prisoner groups, but you see a lot more actions now where prisoners en masse across different racial and organizational groups will act in concert and take over a yard and start setting stuff on fire, or take over a dormitory as a group. You're seeing these much more and more, even though they don't make the national news. Those of us that watch are kind of clocking it. And so enter 2018. And this, so what's essentially holding back this prisoners movement is not only just the repressive apparatus of the state, but the state of outside support. They had previously surveyed and talked to people on the outside, wondering whether or not a national strike was feasible or wanted, in 2018, whether or not it was smart. They concluded no. They're like this cluster of leadership that's calling this national strike conference and said, no, we're going to hold off to 2019. Then Lee, South Carolina happened, where that so-called riot, that setup fight that the administration had been setting up and basically fueling for months, like clocked off. They closed the gates, and 7 prisoners are now dead in South Carolina in April.
Yeah, can you go in and like describe like specifically what happened for people that like I'm not terribly educated on the subject, but I've heard this referenced a couple times. Can you talk about what happened in Lee and what the dynamics were?
Yeah, absolutely. South Carolina is one of these states of the South where it's still on that plantation. Most of everybody inside is black. Basically, if you do anything to a white person in South Carolina, you're guaranteed a prison sentence, even if you don't. It's basically still a lynching state. It's also one of these states with a completely collapsed tax base. California will spend $80,000 per prisoner, per head, to basically maintain them. South Carolina spends like a third of that, if that. And they're basically housed in dormitories, like vastly overcrowded dormitories. Their only means of controlling the prisoner population is with transfers, with increasing brutality, like taking away whatever privileges they might have left. I mean, for example, after McCormick, another prison in South Carolina, basically rose up against not having any more yard time, the horrible food, and basically no programming. They basically responded to that uprising by welding steel plates over windows. So now even sunlight is taken away from prisoners in some facilities in South Carolina. So enter like Lee. Lee had a recent changing of administration. The warden started, came in hard. Thought he was a big man. Started throwing people in the hole for nothing, which happens all the time. But the increased rate, any traction the prisoners had towards actually getting any time in the yard, any rec time, any programming at all, was basically just thrown in the air. It was like never guaranteed. They even took away lockers. This is an important thing. They took away lockers from within the dormitories under the excuse that that was a place to hide contraband. Except that was a very intentional move to like boost lateral hostility between prisoners through the roof. You have no more means of securing any of your own belongings, which drove the people that basically thieved or like preyed on other prisoners. It basically raised that predation to like incredibly high levels. They started doing what's called mix and match or gladiator transfers, where they basically, instead of letting one crew basically run one dormitory and keep the peace and be kind of the negotiating party for this dormitory of 100 people, they basically started intentionally mixing them all up, putting rival sets, rival organizations in with each other to basically attack each other and basically make them a much more manageable population, a population that's basically set about to basically destroying itself. Well, one, like legitimizes the role of the jailer. They can come in and then point to this, ask for more funding, request more guards, and also legitimizes their primary violence. And second, like prisoners always occupied with watching their back, they tend to basically vendettas. They tend to react against each other. And prisoners feuding with each other. I mean, I don't even think I need to explain divide and conquer, but this is exactly what was going on. And like, if you mention this to any prisoner across the United States from any period, of our history, they know exactly what you're talking about. When you talk about gladiator matches or like mix and match transfers, it's used across the board, even in women's prisons as well. It's used in juvie, it's used in counties, it's used in state, it's used in federal. They basically use any rivalries or, differences, sometimes racial, often same racial group, different organization. They'll use that to maintain control. They're basically deputizing state violence onto other people to basically keep it mixed up. This is what happened in Lee. Something sparked off in Lee, a simple fight. In one housing unit, guards rolled the gate shut and essentially told them to go get your man, quote unquote, which means like, go handle your business. They closed the gates, retreated, didn't bring any medical attention. The fight rolled on for hours. The shivs, the knives, the weapons came out, and scores were being settled. And then there were vendettas. And most of the locks inside, even if you retreated to your cell outside of the common area, the locks are so busted up and screwed up that you can't really secure your own cell. There were people that wanted no part of the fight that were basically attacked because they couldn't lock themselves inside their own cell. So the bodies started piling up. They're just being stabbed and dead. And then essentially they were still alive. All medical attention was refused in the first housing unit. They would fight to exhaustion, then they would rest. These were points at which the fight could have been stopped. It wasn't. They let everybody bleed out, and they let the fight continue, and then word rolled to the next housing unit that it was going on. Then all the other members of these different sets started going at it. Once the vendetta started, once they heard people were dying and getting killed, more scores, and it rolled from one to the other, till three of them were involved. And as fights go in prison, a fight might last 5 minutes, 10 minutes, until it gets broken up. This lasted for 8 hours. 8 hours. It's basically an incredibly cynical, brutal, and anti-black gladiator setup in which 7 prisoners lost their lives. They literally were stacking the bodies up at the gate at the front in the hopes that the guards could essentially come and get somebody who was bleeding out, just duck in the gate and pull them out for medical attention. Even that didn't happen. It's suspected more people died, but were essentially hid from the public and the press by being transferred or, basically kind of hiding the death number. There were prisoners saying that there were additional bodies being found in closets that aren't being counted. We've never had a real accounting. After this riot happened, I use the word riot, but there's not even a word for it. This kind of cynical setup, what do you call it? The news called it a mass casualty incident, which is, kind of what the state calls it.
It's very technical.
Yeah. And that's so utterly inhuman. That's such a dry term for such a vicious, thing that it's such a bloody and obvious, manipulation and to basically create such a bloodless term for it. And they continued with that. They basically used it. It got a bunch of attention, which is kind of a warden's nightmare. They never want to be on the news. They're middle management, but they made the news. And suddenly, the perverse novelty and the lust for blood in the American media, the bloodiest riot in however many years. It was the bloodiest, riot in 40 years, since Attica or something that was the headline. So they made the national.
Sorry, the Attica riot.
Yeah, that
was a police riot anyway.
Right,
so.
But these things were being bandied about, and they caught attention. And so, the ensuing media, these prisoners were being killed twice in the way they were being spoken of. No prisoner's voice was allowed whatsoever into any of the news. No prisoner's advocate voice was allowed whatsoever into any of the news. The state was allowed complete utter freedom to spin utter bullshit on how this was just an unfortunate incident with the prisoners being animals and fighting over cell phones. Because cell phones have been the wardens and the DOC heads fixation for quite a while, because they realized that it's one avenue that they really need to shut down. Except that they were serious about it, they'd actually deal with their own guards who are bringing in all the phones. But they want to bring in jammers. They want to bring in surveillance equipment, and the FCC has stopped them because it's actually illegal to mess with a public utility that way. Not to mention you'll completely mess with all the surrounding area, all the guards, and most of the phone traffic going in and out of the prison are your own employees. When guards aren't kicking the crap out of somebody or screwing somebody over, they're scrolling through their phone. That's what they do. And so the media story afterwards was also just a compulsion for the prisoner movement. They saw the sheer level of grief and carnage they witnessed. Many of them had come from those facilities or know people in those facilities or were in them. The sheer level of grief, they conferenced again and said no, we can't hold off. Now is the time. We have to go. There's no time like the present, because many of the prisoners were essentially saying I can't live like this anymore. I want to pick the way I die. And so let it be now. And then so they called the strike for 2018. So that's essentially how 2018 came about. Their experience and knowledge of Lee, South Carolina, and just the way they were treated by the system in the first hand and then by the media in the second, that they had to do something collectively to one, thrust their condition, their situation into the mainstream conversation, because it wasn't going to happen without them. The conversation is not going to be forced. As much as people on the outside try and do stuff, they see themselves as a leadership and basically the ones to kind of push the story. And two, they had to call the strike for the inside to call ceasefire. to galvanize prisoners as a class against the real enemy, the prison system itself, so that like some other like lateral like warfare like Lee doesn't happen again, where they're just stabbing each other up. And that's actually happened. There are sit-downs happening inside. And the uprising in Missouri Crossroads Correctional, that happened in May, was another example of like 4 rival sets negotiating peace amongst each other to basically negotiate a work stoppage and sit down. And on third, the kind of thrust of the strike, it's basically to assert their voice within the movement. They're often spoken of or about or kind of included in other organizations' newsletters, but they see themselves as really excluded as an entity and as a force within the movement. And that's half to blame for the state basically keeping them from doing that. But it's also due to like a hierarchy, basically a natural hierarchy of resources and access that's happening on the outside. You've got your really well-funded and like establishment aligned organizations like Cut 50 with Van Jones, or even the Koch brothers, like talking about prison reform. And then you filter down and you've got all kind of the foundation funded folks. And then lower, you've got kind of the grassroots funded folks. And that's when you start to see the abolitionists kind of filter through. And then you've basically got kind of the scrappy, like people with no funding, like doing stuff. And they're kind of tired of being the bottom of the heap, not being included in any of these roundtables, and only being kind of dressed up and stood up for other people's newsletters. They're done with it. They're basically got the freedom and the action now, and they've got it together enough to assert themselves. And we're kind of one of the groups on the outside that kind of dedicated to them, like taking their proper place in things, not only within the mainstream, within society, but within the movement.
Sort of amplifying their messages. So IWOC, as you said, is like a small scrappy organization that's spread out. And you mentioned earlier that the sort of a measure of the success of inside-outside organizing is, of course, based on there being people on the outside who are doing support work, listening and amplifying the voices, and answering to the requests of the people that are on the inside. Can you talk about, for someone who's listening to this maybe and lives in a rural place where there's not, because the IWW will tend to be focused in places in like larger cities that have radical scenes, but prisons tend to be out in the country in a lot of cases. Are there ways that you would suggest that people get in or can get involved in this sort of organizing, either through IWOC or through any other organizations that are doing outside support for inside organizing around this upcoming strike in August?
I'll say absolutely. I mean, due to the fact that I do a lot of work for IWOC, and I don't live really close to a major institution. Like most of California's institutions are purposely like located in Central Valley in what's called, the prison corridor, and in remote rural areas. A lot of the work happens through correspondence. A lot of the work happens through writing or finding resources for prisoners. A lot of the work can be done remotely. One of the challenges, though, is finding other people to do the work with you. We have to get better at how to organize across geographical distance. And that's just challenging no matter what you're doing. But the demand of the work, we're up against an incredibly opaque, violent, and empowered institution. And we're doing also, I don't know how many of your listeners have actually done really intense care labor or been on the front lines either as an RN or an emergency room nurse or a social worker, or basically been exposed to trauma day in, day out, if not their own, other people's. A huge chunk of the work is incredibly difficult because you basically wake up and go to bed with misery, with violence on your mind. There's nothing pretty about it. And how to basically strategize and continue your work and also just, maintain your own humanity and not become some glib social worker type that just barely even hears your name and just does stuff mechanically. To remain effective and a full human being, demands a collective, demands a group, demands help. I mean, as much as kind of nuts and bolts material work that our Oakland chapter does, half the value is just being there to listen to each other and support each other. Because there's only so much you can take, and also there's an incredible guilt on being on the outside. I would say that was this will be the hardest thing for folks to deal with, Because once you've grasped like the inside situation, once you've grasped the enormity and the totality of the violence of what you're against, and how so many people are wedded to it and like consciously decide to replicate it. You know, this system is basically maintained and created 1,000 times a day with people making intentional decisions to basically sacrifice other human beings, to place them on an altar of power and basically just kill them. So like on the outside, you realize like every minute of every day could be spent doing something. And there's an incredible guilt. Like you're always behind on correspondence and always feeling guilty. So just kind of navigating like how to sustain your own activity in the face of all this trauma, which is exactly like what the prisoners go through inside, and try like how to maintain their own humanity in the face of this. You end up sharing a lot. Like solidarity isn't just a gesture, it's about sharing burden. And you end up sharing a lot of the burden with people inside. So you definitely need a group to basically help do that. Otherwise you just get crushed. Like we're in this for years. This isn't something you just dip into for a month. You just don't dip in for 3 months. You got to think about years. And I'm in it for life. I can't imagine doing this on my own or without a group. So I would say like reach out to any of the IWOC like social media accounts, or you know, IWOC at IWW.org, and we'll try to link you up with other people in the area that you can do work with. I mean, just because you're out in the boonies doesn't mean there's anything you can do. I mean, I handle requests because we don't have a huge network yet. I handle requests for a state over 1,500 miles away, you know, personally. So there's any number of ways of, you know, being able to plug in. And guess what's the fastest rising population within prisons right now? It's
Black women?
No, it's rural populations. Yeah, I mean, racially, demographically, it is Black women, but rural populations are big in terms of like geographically. That's who's going inside. Because basically, rural areas are turning into like wastelands of methamphetamine and joblessness. Well, you know, for a variety of reasons. I would say just because you're in the boonies, like, man, you got the internet. You obviously heard this podcast somehow. That means you have the ability to basically be part of the, you know, abolition movement.
And on that note, like, as you said, carrying the burden and the people on the inside and the outside folks that are organizing. I mean, right then you're also helping to carry the burden and share some degree of experience or overlap with the people's families or the people's communities that are, if you are not personally of a family or of a community that you witness people being taken away and put into a cage for decades, there's kids without parents, there's parents without kids. So right there, that's like a bonding experience. And if you're in one of those rural areas where methamphetamines or where oxycodone or whatever is ripping through your neighborhoods and people are able to keep in, maybe the opportunities for actual sustainable employment aren't an opportunity and people are turning to what would be called quote unquote survival crimes, like this is an awesome opportunity for intervention and community building that it's a holistic thing. It doesn't just go inside and outside of the prison walls. Those are the people that are most directly affected by the brutality of the system, right?
Absolutely. I mean, a good chunk of our work here in Oakland, we devote to doing direct material support outside of our county jail. It's a spot where we can get to, and we know the kind of pattern of releases. And we're out there like as much as we can. Right now, we can be out there like every other week. We're out there at night, and we basically are just out there with hot food, cigarettes, you know, drink, and a ride to the local train station, which they usually make people walk like in their shower shoes or whatever they got arrested in. They release them late at night and hope they make the last train. Or they hope they don't make the last train, actually. So we do direct material support as much as we possibly can. And to tell the truth, like, I've done a bunch of presentations for IWOC, but then you ask and it looks like, oh, sometimes, you know, it's anarchy land. It's, you know, it's basically the scene, or it looks like the local white radicals in like a major city. But then you ask them like, who's had a family member or who has been like, you know, put away? Half the crowd raises their hand. There's a vast swath of this country that is intimately acquainted with the trauma of being incarcerated. I think a lot of people will be surprised at how deep this runs. I mean, once you get into these rooms, people are always kind of asking for your credentials or why you do this work. And I always used to say, like, because it matters. Because, like, this is why it strategically matters. This is why it fits my skill set, yada, yada. But then I started counting, like, the number of different ways I've either had family or people around me locked up. And I've had people put in prison since I was a child. I didn't even realize it. It's so permeated my life. My uncle was locked up in the Navy. Childhood friend is doing life within the California system now. The printer at the print shop that I used to hang out with my dad also, like, came out of San Quentin. I have family right now that's in and out of prisons and jails. So this whole, like, doing something for others is like, no, we're doing something for ourselves. It's basic self-defense. And if you haven't had family or yourself locked up yet, I bet there's 1 or 2 degrees separation with someone that has. And basically you're just still kind of living in a bubble. And just realize that, and you realize that solidarity is about self-defense. It's not some charity trip.
As an abolitionist, there's, like you're saying, you're not a carceral reformer. However, you're part of an organization that is supporting this wider strike, and there are demands being made by some of the folks that are involved in the strike. Does IWOC membership on the inside have demands in terms of changing voting rights or access to programs or, these sorts of things?
Yeah, we support a lot of incremental stuff. I mean, most of prisoners' demands, when you look at them, boil down to essentially asking the state to play by its own written rules. Rec yard, time to this, time for, having decent food, sunshine, access to a book, rehabilitation. These are all things that the state has paid lip service to, and that actually is codified. If you go to your, library or your state library and you look at the regulations for your DOC, they will be about like 12 inches thick, like a huge stack of regulations that basically regulate life down to the most minute detail, even including like the number of square inches allowed for certain types of cells, or like the height of sinks, or like how much time you're allowed for this and for that, and the grievance procedure. The point is that all of that is a joke. I think there's a direct relationship between the amount of brutality and dehumanization and the amount of laws created. Basically, the laws are created basically as a sop, oftentimes in a really inadequate way to basically reform or guarantee, against an abuse of power, except that they operate as a cloak for exactly that, because the power relationship never changes. It never changes. So even when what you're taking on, when you take on a minute thing inside as a prisoner, when you basically say, like, I don't want glass in my food. I don't want that protective custody, like trustee, handling my food and putting glass and blood in it, which is that's a real demand that we've dealt with. Supposedly, that's not abolitionist, though, is it, on its face? That's not demanding for the destruction of the prison system. But what it is demanding is a shift in power. It is shifting power to the prisoner, away from the institution, and it's collectively organizing to do so. I mean, also taken collectively en masse, if you take these small concerns, whether or not you're basically litigating on all the infractions of your basic, all these conditions that are laid out in these thick code books. There's what's called work to rule on the outside. It's an old campaign where you basically follow the rules to the extent that the enterprise, this industry, becomes unworkable. And you basically turn the industry against itself and shield yourself against retaliation. Prisoners do the same thing with litigation or with mass complaints. And essentially that way it's shifting power away from the institution. And simultaneously, it's delegitimizing the prison system because it's constantly highlighting that difference between,
what they say and what they do.
Between ideology and reality, between that proffered, that cloak and what actually goes on, and an assertion of your basic human rights, your basic humanity. And to basically do every single one of these demands in the recent prisoner strike, even though you might not agree with the tactic it's facing, or there might have some repercussions on the road, or might be a dead end, every single one of them is an assertion of one's humanity.
Can you list off what those demands are, and also the date for people, when people are shooting for the strike to start?
Yeah. It starts out with 10, the voting rights of all confined citizens serving prison sentences, pretrial detainees, and so-called ex-felons, quote-unquote, must be counted. Representation is demanded. All voices count. That, even though, like, if you're not down with the electoral thing or state of the day or whatever tactical thing you see in the moment of that being irrelevant, that is an assertion of one's humanity, because to be counted as a citizen within this current political context and have that stripped away, you just by demanding that amount of entry back into social life is to challenge the conditions of social death, of non-personhood that the prisoner is basically confined to. So in this way, when you basically have a hard judgment to make quite a bit. We're actually talking about these things tactically. These demands are good to make. And also, you definitely want to shift power to the prisoner and give them the ability to make these demands. And realize that inside, these demands are basically negotiated across all kinds of differences. Some of these prisoners are straight up black nationalists that want nothing to do with legal procedure and want separation. They want black autonomy. They want the Republic of New Africa to be formed. Some, are basically see themselves as human rights movements, where they basically just want to be treated fairly. Some are still on that electoral stuff. Some prisoners form organizations that are kind of entrepreneurial, where it's kind of they see themselves founding kind of a new nonprofit with kind of themselves at the head of it. But on the inside, they've negotiated across all these differences on a very basic platform that asserts their humanity. And to assert one's humanity against a system that's very overtly and consciously a dehumanizing machine, that's its means of social control, is essentially to challenge the basis of that institution. Demand 9, Pell Grants must be reinstated in all U.S. states and territories. That's financial support, federal financial support for inmate education. 8, state prisons must be funded specifically to offer more rehabilitation services. The key word there is specifically. States often ask for more money, but they basically throw it to the guards or to their own administration system or for more surveillance. They want it to be they want some mechanism by which to actually make sure it goes to rehabilitation and not to the warden's boat or to the guards union. 7, no imprisoned human shall be denied access to rehabilitation programs in their place of detention because of their label as a violent offender. This is key. Right now, we have a reformation of the prison system by which they're creating classes of prisoners. The reformists that don't really identify the whole system as corrupt, are basically creating classes for early release. They're differentiating between violent and nonviolent. And this term and designation is completely within the purview and power relationship of the state to establish. They want this to be thrown out. They want it for all prisoners as a class. 6, an immediate end to racist gang enhancements laws targeting black and brown humans. This attacks directly the kind of extra criminalization, the ultra criminalization inside and out, whether it's gang injunctions, gang enhancement, or gang validations inside. The way that they basically get a jump on the dehumanization and basically up the ante, essentially what's called epistemic violence. Once you teach exactly why someone should have things stripped away from them and have them beaten, the beating can continue much quicker.
And that's sort of that's a reiteration, not the first time and not the last time, of some of the major causes of the huge California-based hunger strikes of 2012, 2013, right?
Oh, absolutely. They use gang validation as a means by which to throw you into solitary. And that's what was put into those thick code books. But it was, for whoever and many people that are actually affiliated, it's a completely arbitrary and unchallengeable, designation that can essentially basically rationalize and codify torture endlessly for life. And it took 30,000 prisoners basically going on hunger strike and a lawsuit and an inside-outside alliance to basically, challenge and get that, changed. And that's still being rolled back. CDCR is still challenging that and rolling it back, by the way. 5, an immediate end to the racial overcharging and oversentencing and parole denials of black and brown humans. Black humans shall no longer be denied parole because the victim of the crime was white, which is a particular problem in southern states. This is the one demand that has a regional, aspect to it, where it's essentially death by incarceration. It's a new form of lynching. This also, it applies everywhere in the United States. And I challenge anyone to basically look at the figures and the sentencing of people going inside and tell me that isn't true. Where essentially whites have the blessings of Roman citizenship under an empire. You touch them and you go to jail. Reverse it is a completely different process. 4, the Truth in Sentencing Act and the Sentencing Reform Act must be rescinded so that imprisoned humans have a possibility of rehabilitation and parole. No human shall be sentenced to death by incarceration or serve any sentence without the possibility of parole. These supposed reform acts where basically they were to take away like life imprisonment or determined sentencing. They're basically to change sentencing guidelines, but what's been done in effect are create what's called Buck Rogers sentences, where you get sentences of like 100 years. Oh, congratulations, you've taken that away, life without parole, but with consecutive like 25-year sentences, you've effectively done the same thing. It's a liberal,
workaround,
shuffling of the cards. Yeah. 3, the Prison Litigation Reform Act must be rescinded, allowing imprisoned humans a proper channel to address grievances and violations of their rights. Now, the Prison Litigation Reform Act in the 90s essentially killed the ability for prisoners to litigate on their own behalf. Not only is it immensely hard to get a hold of nowadays any legal library inside, they say they're provided, but not really. Sometimes you sit jailed in essentially a mesh steel coffin with your hands like chained to a bench, and from 10 feet away inside something the size of a broom closet, you get to choose what book you get to reference. Sometimes that's what's called your legal library. And you have to basically already know what to look for in order to basically construct a case. The Prison Litigation Reform Act actually it took away, they would defer filing fees. They would, now if you file more than 3 times, you basically have to file like anybody else does on the outside, and $400 for someone to file in federal court on the inside, and you're making 6 cents an hour, ironing clothes in the laundry, that's like effectively banned like litigation.
Or accessible only to people who have access to family or community on the outside who do have funding. Exactly.
So it's effectively taken away a prisoner's ability to litigate on their own behalf if you're poor. 2, an immediate end to prison slavery. All persons imprisoned in any place of detention within the United States jurisdiction must be paid the prevailing wage in their state or territory for their labor. Do I need to go into that? I mean, they're compelled to work. There's nothing voluntary about it. People say that they want, like a lot of people will say like these jobs, they volunteer for them. Well, they do when the alternatives are like what we already described as solitary or the hole or complete boredom, or like living within a facility where they welded steel plates over the windows to deny you sunlight. Suddenly, like working in the laundry for like 8 hours for 6 cents an hour, suddenly that looks good. When they deny you toothpaste and shower shoes, when you basically got to work your ass off in order to get those, suddenly, like, working in a fire camp looks good. That's compulsion. Plus, like, the only reason prisons operate whatsoever at this scale is due to the labor of prisoners. It's not because of Victoria's Secret. It's not because of working in AT&T call room. Those things happen. But the majority of prison labor is towards the functioning of the prison itself. And this level of incarceration and social control would not be possible whatsoever without the compelled labor of its prisoners. And also notable, if you refuse a work assignment, at least in California, you lose visitation, commissary rights, and all kinds of rights. You basically knock down the class of prisoner. So if you weren't already getting beat up enough, if you refuse a work assignment, you basically get knocked down to level B or C, which means like you might only be allowed 1 emergency phone call a month, and 1/3 of the level of commissary that you're allowed, which is $30 a month. And number 1, immediate improvements to the conditions of prisons and prison policies that recognize the humanity of imprisoned men and women. A basic call for humanity. Those are the 10 demands. And they've called for the strike to in a 3-week window. They've asked prisoners to undertake whatever they can. All actions are respected. Hunger strikes, work stoppages. If you don't have a job, you can just sit down, refuse movements, or even just boycott commissary. Don't spend your money with the company store. They've called it for August 21st, and that's the hashtag August21, to September 9th, essentially kicking off the day of George Jackson's assassination and ending on the day Attica kicked off.
That's awesome. If you are new to communicating with prisoners, are there any safer approach rules about communication that you should keep in mind for your safety and mostly for their safety?
Well, if it's someone new to corresponding with prisoners, just keep in mind there's a guard reading everything. Even if they aren't, they'll read everything that's going to a certain prisoner they've decided to pay attention to, but basically treat it as though someone else were listening to everything. Speak in roundabout terms. And consider also two things. Like one, absolutely maintain contact with the prisoner. Even if you got to just talk about the weather, it means an incredible lot to people inside. Plus, in terms of repression, guards are bullies. And the people they see that don't have contact with the outside world, they take note of it. Who gets mail, who doesn't? Who gets phone call, who calls somebody with a phone conversation and who doesn't? The ones that don't have people on their side are marked as vulnerable for abuse. Straight up. They will straight up pick on people that don't have contact with the outside and like charge them with more stuff. So not only are you maintaining contact with the loved one, you're basically helping guard against repression. And two, keep it consensual. Don't send in a lot of hyphy, like out of control stuff, because essentially always ask them what they want to hear about, because essentially you can target them for increased repression if you send them stuff unsolicited. A lot of prisoners do not care. They're already at war with the system. It all depends on like what the situation is with the person inside, and basically ask for the consent. If you're going to send in stuff that might get blocked, because someone getting sent a bunch of contraband also gets marked. When I say contraband, that's contraband ideas. If you send them books that are like on the banned list or stuff that mentions strikes or uprisings, this basically gets them marked as a problem prisoner. So consider that.
One more question, if that's okay. Because you did mention the importance of the difficulty of keeping media attention on prisoner organizing and on the circumstances that incarceration creates in the country for people, and mentioned the Stop ICE, Abolish ICE, Melt ICE stuff that's been going on. I mean, they're not the same issues, but they're a product of the same issues, and they're all interrelated in the way that in your definition of abolitionism, you talk about policing and incarceration as being interrelated with a whole mesh of other institutionalized things like sexism, racism, class. Can you talk about, to someone who's been piqued or maybe slightly woke or whatever by being made aware of certain aspects of the cruelty of the internalization of the border in the United States and ICE breaking up families and such, why the prison strike is a part of the same story and deserves their attention?
Absolutely. Once you realize that America is a white settler colonial state, and you basically assess what kind of violent tools and institutions it uses to maintain control and appropriate land and labor and everyone's lives, you see them all as the same thing. It's almost a semantic difference. You talk about ICE, or you talk about jails, or you talk about policing, and it's all the same continuum. It's basically violence applied to subject populations to keep them down. The prison is a kind of conditional system. It's basically an extension of slavery, and also it's basically a pillar of violence on which the whole thing stands. ICE is no different, except it's basically we're not policing European immigrants, are we? We're not policing. By and large, we're policing indigenous people, essentially products of colonialism, Mexicans, Central Americans, or Haitians, Caribbean. ICE is not attacking people flooding over from Canada. So this is just one of the different populations that's basically been appropriated and a target of violence for 500 years. The prisoners inside recognize that there's essentially no difference, and that it's semantic, that the way power views all those below it, basically views the population it basically views society as a big prison. And we all just have different gang classifications within it. We're all classified different security risks. Immigrants are one, gang members, quote unquote, are another, drug users, quote unquote, are another, or to be black or to be brown is to be preemptively basically deemed a criminal. And that they're basically tentacles of the same beast. So I would say any call to abolish ICE without following it up to the ladder to the same power relationship, the same social model of violence that it's basically an extension of, you're basically doing a disservice, And to all those that are basically kind of new to the ICE question, like the same populations that basically get thrown, that basically have to cross the border back and forth, or that are subject to policing, are all the same folks that are subject to like being thrown into state prison.
It's a lot of the same people that are being employed to guard and brutalize these people, as well as the same private corporations that are running shittier and shittier commissaries for people in kitchens and stuff.
Yeah. And it's all the same population that like drifts back and forth between being a cop to being a prison guard. It's all the same, bunch of goons and people that have basically made their deal with the state for a job. It's all the same administrators drifting back and forth, between the administrations. Like these semantic differences are just fantasies that are still being traded in by like a lot of the general public that's still captured by media. Once you get into the industry, or once you get into, or once you're like one of the subject population, once you get locked up, or one of the jailers, both sides of that equation know it's exactly the same thing. It's all the same, brutal equation. It's just the semantic differences like persist due to being captured outside on the media. And the sooner we grow up and basically recognize the realities that basically the jailers and the jailed already know, like the quicker, the closer we'll be to liberation.
Thank you so much for this conversation. And
right on.
Yeah, I hope this gets folks energized and involved. To find past episodes of The Final Straw, you can subscribe to us in your favorite podcatching device or visit the website thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org for 8 years of free audio. If you'd like to hear us on your local radio airwaves, contact your community radio station and tell them to check out the radio tab on our website. Or you can reach us via thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net and we'll try to help in the process. We are up on the most obnoxious social media platforms and can easily be shared after we air. Finally, if you appreciate the work that we do, please consider a one-time donation via PayPal or, better yet, a recurring one via Patreon. If you visit our website and click on the Donate tab, there are instructions there, or you can visit patreon.com/TFSR. If you don't want to support Patreon for bowing to alt-right trolls last year and deplatforming anti-fascist projects, check out the open-source French project LiberaPay at liberapay.com, or the link in the Donate tab on our website, thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, for details of how to make a recurring donation there. All of our content is free, but $1 or more a month can be very helpful to keep us going. Plus, there are some pretty awesome thank yous available.